With pure and excessive pleasure.
Just sex everywhere.
Whether it was straight sex, gay sex, bisexual sex.
All of a sudden there'd be somebody dancing naked. It was crazy.
And you're smashed out of your head on cocaine, and the music is incredible.
Every night, the most famous people in the land showed up to join in this unbridled insanity.
Get pissed drunk if you want to.
And there'd be a lot of sort of spectacles.
Out here because it was a party.
This is also a tale of two unlikely guys from Brooklyn named Steve and Ian, who took a wild ride to the top.
I'm happy.
Everyone wanted to be there, but not everybody got in.
It doesn't matter if you're not shaved. Listen, just go home.
All right, please, everybody back up.
Not getting in made people angry and desperate.
These guys we had thrown out earlier were shooting at us.
People were dying to get in.
A guy tried to crawl through the vent.
And he had died. The smell had gone through the ventilator system.
As the world tried to penetrate their infamous velvet rope, Steve and Ian became drunk with power.
Steve certainly went totally crazy.
Then one day, the boys went too far, and the fun stopped. But Steve and Ian had shrewd and powerful allies.
Well, sure, they're making a lot of money, and they're reporting a lot of taxes.
But in the end, no one could save them, and Steve and Ian went to jail.
They each received 3.5 years.
It's a terrible, terrible experience, and it was tough.
We made some mistakes. More than mistakes.
This is the tale of Steve and Ian's crushing fall from grace and their struggle to rise again. It's a tale of decadence and lost innocence told by the people who were there.
It was a tale of greed and excess and drug invincibility and sexual ignorance and irresponsibility. And it was a lot of fun.
Just come on down to 54.
This is the story of Studio 54. The early to mid-70s were a time of long, serious, and divisive political battles. It was confusing and exhausting, and for a while it seemed like there was simply no escape. But on the night of April 26, 1977, something happened to change all that.
Back up! Back up!
It was only a nightclub. But on that opening night, thousands of people waited outside with a new kind of urgency. It was as if they'd already been waiting too long. What they wanted was in there, and what they wanted was simple.
I want to have some fun.
Studio 54 wasn't just fun. It was a whole new, over-the-top species of fun dedicated to smashing those painful and confrontational boundaries of the early 70s. This unbound ritual drew enormous attention globally and almost instantly. That chilly April night in 1977, Studio 54 became a strange bit of American history. It had touched a powerful nerve.
We're talking about a single pop culture phenomenon that dominated its particular time.
What had been a hidden and outrageous underground was suddenly yanked out of the closet and thrust into the hot glare of the mainstream. Never before, with such high visibility and wide acceptance, had gays danced on the same floor with straights, young with old, black with white, conservative with flamboyant. And never before had the most famous people in the world flocked to where they would so publicly mingle with the anonymous.
It was amazing, I think, where, God, everybody was there.
It was a volatile mixture that would ignite into a public display the likes of which hadn't been seen since ancient Rome.
This was debauchery. This was an orgy.
Be people who'd be quite well known, who'd get up and get sort of drunk and dance for hours and, you know, make spectacles of themselves.
You know, look at this. There's a famous person dancing with a guy. There's a famous actress who's naked.
Excess. I don't think anybody died.
It was magic and madness and mayhem all wrapped up in one extraordinary package.
This nightly spectacle rapidly became the place everyone who was anyone simply had to be. It became the new measure of who was relevant, and a whole new breed of disgruntled and bewildered outcasts emerged.
So here you have, you know, people with their suits coming at a thing, like I'm getting in, like they get in every place else. And they'd be stopped in their tracks, and then you'd see some, like, you know, come walking through, you know, and he turned the tables on the power.
It was a shakedown of popular culture. An outlandish new force now ruled the night. Steve Rubell and Ian Schrager, two regular guys from Brooklyn, had uncorked a phenomenal moment in time.
The timing was absolutely perfect. So many different forces came together.
There was gay power. The women's movement became enormously strong.
You had the pill, so women were finally liberated from the fear of becoming pregnant.
And everybody was open. It was before AIDS. It was before crack.
Throw into the mix that in the 70s, cocaine was not an addictive drug. It just wasn't.
Cocaine was a recreational drug, we thought at that time.
It was a locomotive, and we just sort of got on the train, and it just sort of all happened, and all the forces of the universe came together at the same time.
They were tired of being serious, so everybody went out and went wild.
Idealism was out and hedonism was in.
If Studio 54's hedonism was competing with ancient Rome's, Steve and Ian had something going for them that Caligula never even dreamed of. Disco music.
That music is very conducive to drugs and sex.
Like Charleston was in the 20s, Boogie Woogie in the 40s, the early rock years, disco is the thing today.
It became so hugely successful, such with Saturday Night Fever, which I think was one of the biggest selling albums of all time.
Disco was more than just a music. Disco was an event. Disco was a way of life.
All of a sudden there'd be somebody dancing naked. It was crazy.
It was as if disco had found a shrine to celebrate itself. And inside these walls, it could now reach its climax.
I'm just gonna boogie woogie till I die, and they're gonna play Ain't Gonna Boogie Woogie No More at my funeral. It brought everybody out.
Steve and Ian were just geniuses at anticipating these trends in pop culture.
What we did was to sort of take all those things that were sort of going on culturally at the time, put them together in one room. They were part of this 4-act play during the evening, with the dance floor ever expanding and the lighting show crescendoing and there being a finale, and it was all part of the way the evening worked out.
It's like a show. It's really escapism.
That's what I try to make it be, too, is escapism.
What Steve Rubell and Ian Schrager brought to the New York nightlife scene had never, ever happened before, and really could never, ever happen again.
It was like a Fellini-esque crossed with Busby Berkeley playground, filled with just everything for your hedonistic needs.
We must be in heaven, man!
In the same way the 60s waited for Woodstock, the late 70s was a time in search of a defining place. In Studio 54, the beat had been captured, and that very particular time had found a home.
It was an extraordinary moment. It didn't last very long.
Coming up next, the impossible challenge of penetrating the infamous velvet rope.
I remember one night standing there and they didn't let Cher in. I was like, whoa, now this is the spot.
And then later, more sex and drugs.
We were part of the scenery and everyone wanted, you know, I don't know, to sleep with one of the 54 busboys or bartenders or waiters or whatever.
You could have a waiter if you wanted.
I saw somebody shooting up in the bathroom, and it was disgusting.
When Behind the Music continues.
I talk to people from all over the world, and their ultimate dream is to get in 54.
Disco music was bringing everybody out to dance in 1977, but Studio 54 was not letting everybody in. This gave rise to another first, Studio's notorious door policy.
I want to get in here. I drove an hour and a half. I got an invitation. I want to be in the hottest spot in town.
Steve Rubell used to say that he wanted his perfect crowd to be a tossed salad.
You have a mix of the whole population of the world here.
If any one group got too out of proportion on any given night, it would be a damper on the energy. So if too many women, or too many men, or too many couples, or too gay, or too black, or too young, or too old.
The boundaries between age and race and sexuality had given way to a new boundary, the velvet rope.
I don't even think there was ever a door policy before Studio 54.
Say people can't get in, and that's the one place they want to go.
Now you were either in or out.
Sitting here right as I am right now, in front of the rope, maybe first to go, and you don't get in. They don't acknowledge your presence.
Don't even know you're alive. Don't even know you exist.
For the first 3 or 4 weeks that we were open, there were 5 times as many people on the street than there were in the club.
And Halston and other people going, Stevie, you know, why don't you let some people in? You know, there's no one in here. It's really boring, you know? And Steve said, I don't recognize anybody out there. I can't find anyone.
Steve had a tendency to be rude and obnoxious. You know, when he was out front, it was his club. You know, he'd choose the beautiful people, and, you know, he wouldn't think twice about insulting you about what you were wearing or how you look.
Oh, you're not shaved? There's no way in a million years you're going to get in. It doesn't matter if you're not shaved. Listen, just go home.
If anyone ever came up and asked to come in, they'd never get in.
It doesn't change. It doesn't matter. My cousin is nice, and I love her, but that doesn't affect coming into here.
A ferocious appetite was building outside to be part of Steve's tossed salad. And no one became more famous, more infamous at tossing it than Steve's unflappable right hand, Mark Beneke.
Oh, Mark Beneke had a certain hauteur, which was perfectly suited for his job.
2 out there, please, on the left.
I mean, Mark could stand at the front because he had been at it for a while, and there'd be somebody right in front of him, and he would not even look at him. And the guy'd be talking to him, please let me in, you know, I'll do anything.
He would just look right, you'd be like right there, and he'd be like, there was nothing. It was clear. It was transparent. It was arrogant.
I remember one night standing there and they didn't let Cher in. And she says, well, I'm Cher. And Mark Beneke says, yeah, I know who you are. Hold on.
Some celebrities get special treatment, others don't.
I was like, whoa, now this is the spot.
Dario! Here we go! Can you get me into studio?
You know, the whole thing was so ridiculous and absurd, you know, and so I just took the absurdity to its greatest height.
Having a great time. 2 out there, please.
It was theater out there. I think people have to look at it in that context, that there was as much of a show outside as there was inside.
You got to see the limousines pulling up and the celebrities arriving.
A lot easier also to meet people online. You're outside, you can see what people look like. People all had the same goal. If they all got rejected and met some very nice girls.
One of the great ironies of all this is that if Steve and Ian didn't own Studio 54, many believe they would have never been allowed in.
He wouldn't have been able to get in. I wouldn't have let him in. I certainly wouldn't have let Ian in.
So how did 2 guys who wouldn't be admitted to their own club get their own club?
Well, Brooklyn made me hungry.
I mean, here was a kid from Brooklyn who went to Syracuse University, you know, was running a pizza business up there, a pizza delivery business. I mean, and suddenly was the arbiter of New York nightlife, of international nightlife.
Ian and I grew up in the same neighborhood in Brooklyn, but we didn't know each other because, you know, you can be like 2 feet away from somebody and not know them, you know, there. So we met up at Syracuse and we became friends.
After graduating, Ian went on to become a real estate lawyer. And then later, when the more aggressive Steve wanted to expand his fledgling restaurant business, he called on his old friend to help him out. Together, they opened a meat and potatoes chain called Steak Lofts. Even then, there were subtle hints that they wanted to do something a little sexier. So they redesigned one of their steak lofts into a flashy night spot in thoroughly unfashionable Queens. It was called the Enchanted Garden, and Richie Notar was one of their first employees.
Being in a Queens discotheque was not the coolest thing, but it was, for Queens style, it was great.
Meanwhile, in Manhattan, an enormous building sat empty on 54th Street.
The place was sitting there for years, empty. Nobody had the balls to take it.
For 30 years, 254 West 54th Street had been a CBS radio and television studio where shows like What's My Line, The $64,000 Question, and The Jackie Gleason Show had originated. CBS moved their studios to California in the early 70s, And then in 1976, a German socialite named Uwe Harden wandered into the building, saw the potential, and signed a lease to open the largest nightclub the world had ever seen.
I think there's going to be a big change.
Uwe had the idea. You know, he was really a man about town and knew a lot of cool people. He put the whole thing together.
You get the money, the idea, the people behind you. You apply for a liquor license and you open it.
Enter Carmen D'Alessio, who virtually invented the art of party promotion in Manhattan. She had been working with Uwe in creating his mammoth new space, and also with Steve and Ian in their faraway Queens night spot. So when Uwe lost his financial backing, Carmen brought them all together.
So I decided it was time for the guys to come and check out the Big Apple. So I brought them hand in hand, and they saw the space, and they were just in awe because they liked it so much. I think that Uwe was just paid off like a finder's fee, but they raised additional money through a silent partner, Jacques Duché, and the rest is history.
In the winter of 1976, Steve Rubel and Ian Schrager became the new proprietors of the daunting building at 254 West 54th Street.
You know, Studio 54 was conceived, built, and opened within 6 weeks. So it was like this, spontaneous rush.
So here they were, two very different guys. Ian was straight and painfully shy. Steve was gay and fiercely sociable. But both shared common roots in the outer boroughs they now disdained as the new owners of the most exclusive and glamorous nightclub in the history of nightlife.
I became friendly with Steve. He was a very friendly, gregarious guy.
He'd jump in on everything. He was really obnoxious.
He was an adorable, lovable person, but I didn't take him very seriously.
Steve was like a big kid in a toy store. I was quite rude to him many times.
Yeah, the one I took seriously was Ian Schrager.
Ian Schrager, nobody knew. His nickname was Greta, as in Greta Garbo, you know.
I bet people never even realized there was a man called Ian Schrager.
I never had any contact whatsoever with Ian Schrager. I couldn't even tell you what he looked like.
Ian was always in charge of making sure the sound was fabulous and the lighting. And
I love design. It's really the way I express myself. So it's just like part of the tools we use in creating the space. We've had no training.
Steve was on the phone constantly inviting.
Jack Haley, please.
I'm a people person. I've been since I've been a baby.
Jack, Liza's waiting for you. She doesn't know where you are. She's worried about you.
I mean, I always compared them as Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin.
Not only is he my business partner, he's also my best friend. It's a very special relationship.
Their partnership worked. Their phenomenon had already changed the rules of popular culture and would alter many lives, not least of all their own. Steve Rubel and Ian Schrager had created the ultimate big experience of the late 70s.
At Studio 54, it was impossible to get in. It was a total nightmare. But once you were in,
it made you feel like you were at the most exclusive party in the world, not just in New York, but in the world.
Coming up next, getting in and being there. First-hand reports from the inner sanctum.
I used to have boxes of amyl nitrate and run upstairs to the air conditioner duct and just pop these damn things and the whole joint would come off its feet.
And a special secret world where even the celebrities could completely unravel.
I mean, Mick, he used to disappear all the time in some back, inner sanctum. I don't know what they did in there, but I wasn't in there.
When Behind the Music continues.
Love to love you, baby. No, it's very sexual. It is sexual, of course. Disco is very sexual.
The public displays of affection at Studio 54 are the stuff of urban legends. But in those liberated, birth-controlled pre-AIDS days, and especially nights, the only political incorrectness was restraint. In other words, it's all true.
Just sex everywhere. I don't care what you were into. If you were in there, it was there.
We used to have, sex in the bathrooms all the time, whether it was straight sex, gay sex, bisexual sex. Because the bathrooms, we had a men and women's bathroom, but people used to use both all the time.
It's very sexual. My nipples are like erasers. No doubt about it. Push, push in the bush.
Our first date was, hi, you look real nice.
Hi. You didn't need much more than hi.
That was a first date. And 10 minutes later, you would have your third date.
Do
You thought they were cute. It was like, okay.
And you're smashed out of your head on cocaine, which was not addicting. And the music is incredible.
You start kissing on the dance floor, and the next thing you know, you're...
Because especially in those days, at least couples, they look to disappear upstairs and, you know, do their business.
One of my favorite memories about Studio 54 is laying back up in the balcony, having sex where they still had the seats, and looking down there and seeing this tribe of people dancing down there. It was just like, it was like the future. It was like things you read about in the past, and here it is happening right now.
The scent of sex was everywhere. It was as much a part of the design as the lighting. Studio 54 was a complete other environment, and it was up to the staff to maintain it. A tough job, but they were up to the task.
We were part of the scenery, and everyone wanted, you know, I don't know, to sleep with one of the 54 busboys or bartenders or waiters or whatever.
You could have a waiter if you wanted.
The guys behind the bars, I mean, all pumped up and just going with the music.
We danced and we flirted and we teased, men and women. It did make a difference.
Yeah, those busboys were real cute. Those bartenders were sexy.
Oh, I was the first one to take my shirt off. So all the other bartenders are big, muscular guys, you know, and I'm this little skinny guy from Queens, and we're working, and I'm sweating my ass off. So I take my shirt off. You know, I figure there's drag queens running around. There's people half naked. I can take my shirt off. Steve comes up and says, "Oh, that's great. I like that. Scotty, you put your shirt back on. You guys take your shirts off."
Scotty and I, we had a lot of fun together. You know, we competed for some of the same girls. We probably even shared a few. In fact, I know we had.
There was just this beautiful woman there, and I just thought, my God.
I think we should just be sexual. This way, I can have anyone.
Those women aren't in Missouri. You know, they're not made there. So I just, you know, and I found myself sort of with her, and then I realized about midway through that in fact it was not a woman at all, that it was a man. From that moment on, I sort of had a test that I gave everyone.
Then, of course, there were the drugs, with this disclaimer.
Anybody that claims to remember everything did not have fun in those days. It becomes as a blur.
When was the heyday at 54?
I don't know what year Studio 54 opened.
Yeah, by 79, and I think it was a New Year's. It was a New Year's.
Let me see, when was that? I can't remember.
But that was later, wasn't it?
Like they used to say, if you can remember it, you weren't there, you know.
For those who were there and can remember enough to tell us about it, the tales of public drug use at Studio 54 are another clear case of the myth living up to its reputation.
I saw somebody shooting up in the bathroom, and it was disgusting. Even if I wasn't working, I wouldn't have put myself at the mercy of these people offering me drugs.
One had a bag full of joints, one had a bag full of Quaaludes, one had a bag of Little Sniffer. And that was handed out whenever somebody needed it for this party or that party. I mean, it was just like favors. I used to have boxes of amyl nitrate and run upstairs to the air conditioner duct and tell the DJ to pump the beat up to 112 and just pop these damn things, and the whole joint would come off its feet.
The thing is, it was about doing Quaaludes and cocaine was the drug.
You know, you just have it on I don't know, like a gold platter, you know. And I think you have a toothache, you stick a little there, you know.
Basically, it was a bunch of drug addicts running loose, because cocaine was not addicting.
If anyone inside this playpen ever looked for a model as to what might or might not be appropriate behavior, they need look no further than to the top.
And there was always an element about Steve that kind of scared me. You didn't know which way he was going to be going, because he liked to party, and you know he could be very buzzed, very, very stoned.
She does her own clothes, I can tell. I had this baby last month, don't tell anyone.
Well, he was always stoned, I thought. I never paid any attention to anything he said to me because I knew he didn't know what he was talking about.
I was all over the world. I'm happy.
Steve had created a parallel universe for himself and all his friends, a sort of united altered states.
like this force field. I kept thinking William Shatner was going to appear and say, you know, you're in the wrong world here, come with us. Let me save you.
The one time I went to Studio 54, I was on a triple date with Michael Jackson, Andy Warhol, and my date was Susan Blonde. I took a nice big hit off of this joint I was being offered for free. And I thought, wow, this New York, wow, it's so chic here. Look at this. They smoke marijuana in public. And Susan Blonde said, come on, let's go dance. And I'm like, towers would be like lowered so they were down at floor level, so you'd be dancing with these, you know, something went wrong. They were like waving a little bit and they looked almost like weed whackers. They hit people. The dance floor was crowded. They started cutting into people. I saw blood and fingers and things flying. I'm going, oh my God, I'm standing there staring at this scene of carnage. She goes, did you smoke some of that joint? And I go, you mean the marijuana? She goes, that was angel dust, you idiot. And so that was my one trip and my one date at Studio 54.
It's a highly amusing place. I come here about once a week.
Which brings us to yet another of Studio 54's excesses not often seen in quite the same way these days. The celebrities.
Out here because there's a party at Studio 54.
I mean, everywhere you turned, there was celebrities.
How could I not get a thrill out of meeting Barbra Streisand or any of those people?
Liza Minnelli was hanging out with like Baryshnikov and giggling.
Michael Jackson when he was less agoraphobic.
And Halston was there, you know, screaming.
You know, Cher.
Or even Betty Ford would come in.
The biggest celebrities in the world.
Early on, Joanne Horowitz was in charge of getting them there.
So I'm the one who called all the record companies, and I'm the one who called all the movie companies. So all these celebrities showed up, so Ian and I sat down and we made an arrangement about how much I would get for a celebrity that I would bring in.
If celebrities had been staying home in the early 70s, just like the rest of us, they now saw something fresh and delicious out there to feed on. Themselves.
This is said to have been the first time that photographs of famous people were ever published on the front page of a newspaper for no particular reason, you know.
I think they all became more important, and they became very taken with themselves. They were part of the show.
And I think that's what people really liked, you know, all that brown nosing. It was quite fun.
By today's standards, it seems unthinkable that a celebrity being watched by an ever-present world press would indulge in the excesses that made being at Studio 54 so unique. But the unthinkable was what this place was all about.
Celebrities like to play, and there was a way here for a celebrity to be photographed and then vanish.
There was a basement that occasionally, you know, people would wander down into.
When you wanted to get away from the media, there was plenty of photographers and things like that.
I mean, Mick, he used to disappear all the time in some back, you know, inner sanctum. I don't know what they did in there.
I knew a lot about it, but I was never invited to it, and I often think that maybe I'm only still alive because I was never invited to it.
People would go down there and have sex, people go down there and have conversation, people go down there to get high.
There was lots of sex in the basement. Lots of sex in the basement.
It was, I think it was a concrete floor and chain. It was a basement.
Steve would say, okay, let's go downstairs. And you just walk through and see.
Like Halston or Liza Minnelli or Mick Jagger. It was all like the creme de la creme.
And it was a place where they could go kick up their heels and be outrageous, and yet feel protected at the same time.
Get pissed drunk if you want to, or, you know, no one was criticizing you.
Because they had incredible security and bouncers and heavyweight guys standing around to be sure that nobody, you know, carried Bianca off against her will.
Meanwhile, back upstairs, the voyeurism continued from both sides.
It was more like the famous people came to see the nobodies.
It is the best floor show in town.
And Steve cast the show for the evening, and he entertained the celebrities. They were the voyeurs.
And the rich and the fabulous and the famous people will always follow where the scent of young blood and sex is, okay? I mean, let's be real here.
Studio 54 was a spawning ground, a place where a nobody from the uncharted regions of Manhattan street life might suddenly become a major influence on the world's top fashion designers.
They found the fashion for their new drawings, for their new fashion line. They saw them on the kids that were dressing up flamboyant.
All the costumes and the kids and everybody all having a really good time.
I love fantasy.
Oh, yeah.
And clothes, really.
Steve really loved fashion designers, and he really recognized their stardom because everything kind of revolved around them. Celebrities, etc., revolved around the fashion designers.
You dressed up. I can remember Victor Hugo going out with chaps. I mean, we were art.
He wears the finest clothes, the best designers have.
Carmen D'Alessio had worked in the fashion industry and had seduced many of the designers into the club with elaborate special events.
You can have the discotheque with a couple of businessmen, but they don't necessarily have to know about fashion.
These parties became another of Studio 54's extravagant firsts.
Because Ian and Steve had no limits when it came to spend it, because they do realize that in order to get, you have to give.
We started out doing these, what we call theme parties, once a month, where we would transform the place for just one day. Then come back the next night, it would be right back to where it was when it started.
Karen Bacon was this events coordinator, and she was there choreographing the Flying Truffladoras, which is a gay ballet troupe.
And for Armani, at the entrance, there were 20 violin players in white tails. We did a party for Michael and Tina Chow. We changed the entire studio into like a Hong Kong scene out of a movie.
They did a Halloween party. I haven't been to Disney World, but it was like a cool version of that. I mean, it was awesome. They created atmosphere. No one will ever do that again.
By 1978, just a year after its opening night, Studio 54 was at the peak of its game. Steve and Ian were the undisputed rulers of nightlife worldwide. But the peak of anything is only visible after the decline that follows it. Studio 54 was not going to last forever. Coming up next, Bad Omens, the beginning of the end.
Steve certainly went totally crazy. I mean, he just behaved in a totally crazy way.
At one point in time, Steve Rubel was interviewed, and he made a statement. We make so much money, only the mafia makes more, but I better not talk because the IRS might hear it. I said, this is bad.
When our big boss saw that, he underlined it and sent it down to the Criminal Investigation Division. Actually, that article was a red flag.
When Behind the Music continues. In 1978, after being open for a year, Studio 54's unheard-of success was like a surreal dream, and it started to affect its dreamers. Steve and Ian could never have prepared for the power they now had, and they began to flaunt it. First, they had no liquor license. Each night, they would obtain a one-night-only cabaret permit, which would allow them to serve alcohol for just that night. Every 24 hours, they had to renew it. Studio 54 was much too visible for this sort of flagrant bending of the law, and the state liquor authority was watching very carefully. One night, they simply forgot to get their nightly permit.
You saw like 30 guys coming in uniforms. At first, I thought they were like, you know, dressed, that was their outfit for the day. We're policemen, you know? Until all of a sudden, there were like 50 of them, and they arrested one of the bartenders, and that's when I realized these guys aren't the village people there.
The state liquor authority revoked their right to obtain a nightly cabaret permit. They could not serve alcohol, an unfortunate turn of events for a nightclub. The stars came out in support, but Steve and Ian had a formidable secret weapon that ultimately made the difference: Roy Cohn. He was the infamous and well-connected attorney who had sent Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, the couple accused of being Russian spies, to the electric chair amidst enormous controversy. He was Senator Joe McCarthy's right-hand man during the darkest days of McCarthyism's witch hunt of would-be communists. More recently, Mr. Cohn had represented the gangster, Fat Tony Salerno, and may have been the first bad omen that this man was now the toast of the town.
He was dastardly smart. Oh, he was so smart. He was always trying to use you for some of his vendettas or to accomplish something or other.
Roy Cohn got a judge, I believe his name was Hyman Korn, who used to be a close friend of Roy Cohn's father, who was also a judge, to overturn the SLA's decision and to issue them back their license. Anything they would have been indicted for or attacked by, he would have found a judge to overturn it. So basically, they were immune to any sort of prosecution state-wise. I'm not saying federal-wise. You could go into Studio 54. You could have drugs openly. There was a big moon with a Coke spoon there. It was known this was a place where you could do drugs. But with the power that Roy Cohn had, Steve and Ian felt like they were gods, like they were untouchable.
They had their liquor license. Studio 54 had become an impenetrable fortress at the top of the world. But the men and women who ran the place, just like Steve and Ian, were from average neighborhoods and towns, some with populations smaller than the crowds clamoring outside. Eventually, these ordinary people started to feel the weight.
The life is a tough life. You're drinking or you're doing drugs and you're staying up late. And I think that mixed with this great sense of power, was seductive. And you begin to misuse it. And you begin to think that you, in fact, are a little better than the next person.
Oh, I think I just became a total monster. I was rude to everyone. I walked around like I was Henry VIII. I broke off every conversation in mid-sentence and walked away.
Oh, well, there isn't any question that they became drunk with power and with their popularity and with the fact that everybody wanted to get into Studio 54.
They had become the kids with all the marbles. They ruled the playground. And like any gang of kids without supervision, they got a little mean.
One of the things he would do is he would tell women, well, if you take off all your clothes, I think, we'll let you in. And in the middle of the winter, these women would be buff naked.
And I was standing right next to her, and it was cold that night. And this lady literally took all her clothes off.
And no chance of getting in. And I can remember there was one instance in which the girl had to go to the hospital with frostbitten nipples.
As always, the door staff took its cues from Steve. What had started as simple fun began to mutate and spread.
The doorman goes, okay, the guys can come in, but the women can't. And I just thought to myself, well, that's a interesting door policy.
I'm going to play a little game here, a little power game. I'm going to test them. I'm going to test their morality.
The couple, they had just gotten married a few hours ago. And, we told them, we told the guy that he could come in and his wife couldn't.
And I remember the look this woman gave the guy. But he went in, and she stood there and waited for him. People would just leave friends, family, wives, just go in.
It got meaner on both sides of the rope. For many, getting into Studio 54 had become a religious pilgrimage. The pressure to be accepted mounted and got ugly.
This car, literally, I was there that night, jumped the sidewalk and tried to kill, I was hoping he did, he tried to kill the doorman.
We got out of there after 7, and we walked out through one of the back entrances, and all of a sudden, these guys we had thrown out earlier were shooting at us.
Studio 54 was under siege, and the stakes went up and up.
Another thing that was happening in Studio 54 would be people trying to crash into the club by mountain climbing down the buildings next to Studio 54, which was only 11 stories.
A guy tried to crawl through the vent.
And he couldn't go forward and he couldn't go back. He got jammed. He must have pulled a muscle or something, and he had died. And his body had begun to decay, and the smell had gone through the ventilator system because of that.
I heard somebody fell, but I didn't hear anybody died. But I wouldn't be surprised. People were dying to get in.
2 decades later, the doormen look back.
It was wrong. It was a fascist statement, at that point for me.
I could never, ever do the door now. There's just no way.
Well, if I had to confront the people that I never let in, I would like to just know they're not hunting me.
What would I say to all those people? Sorry seems to be the hardest word. I don't know.
It wasn't funny to these guys back then, and many people liked them. It was as if Studio 54 became more about defending itself than about fun. And it had reason to be defensive. The times were changing.
And it's about a punk terrorist plot to kidnap Andy Warhol and blow up the Studio 54 disco.
Punk had been around since the early 70s, but like disco, it had to gain some momentum before its message would be heard. It was all about rage, and while studios snubbed that rage outside its ropes, this new music was focusing it into a full-blown movement. Suddenly, there was an edgier and more relevant scene going on downtown that was the antithesis of everything Studio 54 represented. It was a real threat to Studio's eminence and arrogance, but Steve and Ian didn't believe in threats.
You know, I think they had a lot to do with the sort of downfall of the club. You think that you become invincible.
And they, I think, lost a certain reality. Ian was more settled and responsible, but Steve certainly went totally crazy. I mean, he just behaved in a totally crazy way.
Finally, one day, Steve Rubell went too far.
At one point in time, Steve Rubell was interviewed by, I think it was New York Magazine, and he made a statement that we make so much money, only the mafia makes more, but I better not talk because the IRS might hear it. I said, this is bad. This is a very bad, for someone to make a remark like that in a public publication is insane.
Coming up next, Roy Cohn takes Steve and Ian into battle.
Well, you know what all the warrants say. The warrants say we received a tip or an information and belief the place is making a lot of money. Well, sure, they're making a lot of money, and they're reporting a lot of taxes.
But even Roy Cohn can't save his illustrious clients.
They were initially incarcerated at the Metropolitan Correctional Center.
Jail will humble anybody. It's a terrible, terrible experience.
When Behind the Music continues. Steve Rubell and Ian Schrager had flaunted their invulnerability like emperors, and it was no surprise that the powers that be were laying in wait. So when Steve finally made that reckless comment to New York Magazine, it was heard loud and clear by all the wrong people.
When our big boss, the boss of all New York, saw that, he underlined it and sent it down to the Criminal Investigation Division and said, you know, what are you guys doing about that? So actually, that article was a red flag.
The days of Studio 54's undisputed reign were now numbered, and when the federal authorities got a lucky break, the end was clearly in sight.
A person contacted our office and said that he had worked for Studio 54 and that they were skimming money. We contacted the Justice Department, Mr. Peter Sutter, Assistant U.S. Attorney.
He was let go at the time when the club was really starting to attain its prominence. And he was very bitter about it. And he was the person who enabled us to get probable cause to get a search warrant.
This person, who prefers to remain nameless, had given the feds information about double sets of books and enormous stashes of undeclared cash at Studio. The government had a strong case, but this wasn't just anywhere they were preparing to bust.
Before the search warrant was executed, we had tried to get agents in to verify the layout of Studio 54, but because of their rather restrictive door policy, our agents were not able to get in.
Ultimately, even the velvet rope proved to be insufficient in stopping the Internal Revenue Service. At 9:30 on the morning of December 14th, 1978, the unconquerable Studio 54 was raided.
And we went up and knocked on the door, and the man opened the door. It was just a cleaning man, and we all went in. We had about 30 or 40 agents.
It must have been 100, 150 of them. And I walked in, and everyone was sitting, employees, around the DJ booth. Must have been 10. I was like, what's going on? I was like, you, what are you doing? You know, I came to get my check. Now sit over here and don't move.
Shortly thereafter, Ian Schrager showed up as he always did. He was carrying his mail and some papers.
He said, I'm one of the owners of the club. He said, can I go upstairs? As he was going upstairs, one of the agents said he forgot his mail, and he picked it up. He found an envelope that contained cocaine. We called down the U.S. Attorney's Office, got permission from Mr. Sutter, we got a warrant, and we arrested him.
And then Roy Cohn walks in.
He was present on the day of the raid, having been called, I guess, by Rubell or Schrager.
And all of a sudden, the face on these guys that were ordering us around dropped, and they're like, oh, and he just said, what? They won't. You go wherever you want, blah, blah, blah. And it was like, yeah, you know, now my backup's here.
Is that a drug charge against That's Mr. just Schrager? What I told you about, because they say that he was on the premises when they found this envelope with these 5 little packets of white powder. It was not in his briefcase. They do not allege it was in his briefcase. I've read the complaint, and I was in court, and you weren't.
Roy Cohn always affected a process whenever he got involved.
We have a lawyer down there right now to get these people out of this place.
Go this way, please, thank you.
I feel like the president today.
If Steve was still feeling invincible, sidled up to his powerhouse pit bull lawyer, he wasn't thinking too clearly about what was being hauled out of Studio 54 that day. The agents had hit pay dirt.
With a double set of books. There's a set of books for IRS, and there's a set of books for the three partners.
Rubel and Schrager and Duche would sit around and they would calculate their expenses for the evening, write them down on the envelope, and then they would actually write on the envelope SKIM or SK, and they would each put down a third of what they were taking.
Well, you know what all the warrants say. The warrants say we received a tip or an information and belief the place is making a lot of money. Well, sure, they're making a lot of money, and they're reporting a lot of taxes, period.
Probably grossing, as I recall, in the neighborhood of about $5 million in sales.
For 1977, Studio 54 had paid only $8,000 in taxes. As the investigation continued, $100,000 in cash was found in the trunk of Steve's car, and $900,000 in cash was found in a safety deposit box at Citibank. Steve and Ian had been caught, undeniably. Still, under all this pressure, Steve Rubel remained Steve Rubel.
I remember asking Steve Rubel that if I was outside waiting to be admitted into Studio 54, whether I'd get in, and he looked me dead in the eye and he said, "No, you're one of the great people." And I was absolutely stunned that he would say this to me in the context of the conversation we were having in the U.S. Attorney's Office. Rubel could not keep his mouth shut, and I know his attorneys tried to muzzle him, but they were not effective in doing that.
You were asking the procedure.
I don't do the accounting work.
But that was Steve Rubel. He pretty much said what was on his mind.
But there was fear in the air. They were guilty, and no one could save them. To avoid an ugly public trial they could never win, they began to plea bargain.
The cocaine charge was dismissed. Both defendants pleaded guilty to 2 counts of income tax evasion, which carried a possible term of imprisonment of 10 years.
Reality was closing in fast, so Steve and Ian did what they always did. They relied on their creative team to come up with something big, something distracting, something to stir the imagination.
Cohn and some of the other defense lawyers decided that there was a possibility of getting their clients off by bringing to the government's attention an allegation of cocaine use by the then White House Chief of Staff, Hamilton Jordan, under President Jimmy Carter.
It didn't seem like a very smart thing to do, and I don't think it was true either.
Ultimately, charges were not brought. As far as a strategy to get them out of this mess they were in, it didn't work at all.
The government really went after them after that.
Steve and Ian's team had recklessly miscalculated, but their silent partner, Jack Duche, hadn't. In exchange for leniency, Jack gave the government detailed first-hand information on the 3 partners' skim scam, and it nailed Steve and Ian's coffin airtight. After pleading guilty to 1 count of tax evasion, Duche did no time in jail. Steve and Ian each pleaded guilty to 2 counts of tax evasion, and on January 18, 1980, they were sentenced in a Manhattan courtroom.
The feeling in the courtroom was really almost one of a feeling of revenge.
And they got a very long sentence for tax evasion.
They each received 3.5 years, which up to that time was an almost record sentence.
This was a last gasp, in a funny way, of a certain kind of decadent innocence, where they believed people believed they could just do anything and get away with anything. And it was proved to Steve and Ian that they couldn't. I mean, Studio 54 became a kind of Frankenstein monster that turned on its creators.
On February 1st, 1980, 1 month after the end of the decade they helped to define, Steve Rubel and Ian Schrager went to jail.
They were initially incarcerated at the Metropolitan Correctional Center.
Jail will humble anybody. It's a terrible, terrible experience. And I would have a window where I would look out and you could see Chinatown. I would just stand there for hours watching the people roam up and down. And it was tough.
Steve called me a lot. Not every day, but he called, just to see what was going on.
I remember Steve would call from jail and want to know how the count was.
The count was good. And while Studio 54 was allowed to stay open so the government could collect its money, people were still scrambling to go to the now infamous nightclub. But on February 28, 1980, 1 month after Steve and Ian went away, Studio 54's liquor license expired. It would not be renewed in the name of 2 convicted felons, so Studio 54 closed for 15 months.
And it was really sad and everybody was talking about it. But, you know, there was always something else to do.
Studio's clientele was fickle, and Steve and Ian knew it. They were determined to keep the place alive, and even behind bars, they needed to do something fast. For the first time, they were vulnerable and needed help. They needed a buyer with a clean slate.
They wanted me to meet the person that was going to be the new owner, Mark Fleischman. And so there was no other place to meet except in jail.
Mark Fleischman was a respectable hotel owner who had been granted liquor licenses in New York State before. He was the perfect ally.
When they did lose their liquor license and went to jail, I knew Roy Cohn very well, or fairly well, and he arranged for me to go in on our visiting day, and I met with Steve and Ian in jail, and we actually made the deal in jail and signed the papers. And I had to deal with the IRS. In the time I was there, I think I paid about $3.5 million of their taxes and paid it off.
With its new owner, Studio 54 would survive, and Steve and Ian would be allowed to be consultants. They now had new motivation to get out of jail, to get back to work. They were now ready to cooperate with the government. This time, they wouldn't aim so recklessly at the White House Chief of Staff, at a complete stranger. This time, they would give real information about their first-hand experience with illegal cash transactions committed by some of their old friends and competitors.
They cooperated after that and made very, very significant cases for the government.
Against the Bon Disco, Maurice Brahms and John Addison and Fifi Dorsey.
Maurice Brahms was a veteran nightclub owner who early on had shown the boys the ropes of the business.
When I was about to be indicted, Peter Sudler said to me, "You don't want to go to jail. Why don't you be smart and do what Rubel and Schrager did? You know, give me information. You don't have to go to jail." What he wanted from me was the names of people I'd given cash to, such as carpenters, masons, people like that. I could not do that. And when I read the affidavits leading to the search warrants and I saw that Steve and Ian both did this, I was very shocked that Ian did it. Steve was a very, very personable person, but he was very devious and treacherous, and I found that out. Ian was much more laid back, more sophisticated, smarter. But the fact that he still has never faced up to it and said, "I at least owe you an apology, Maurice. I was weak. I did it. I couldn't help it." I can understand that because you're under a lot of pressure in there and people are very tempted to give people up. I can live with that. I can't live with the fact that he still makes believe it never happened.
Maurice Brahms refused to cooperate with Peter Sudler and was sentenced to 3 years in prison for tax evasion. Steve and Ian completed their sentence at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama. They were released on January 21, 1981, after serving just under 1 year of their 3.5-year sentence.
They, based on their cooperation, brought a motion to reduce sentence, which was eventually granted.
They had bartered with the freedom of an old friend to gain their own. Neither of them have had much to say about it since.
I didn't handle it so great. I mean, I got myself in trouble, and but I'm first beginning to be able to look back on it now and even talk about it.
That great success that was thrust upon Steve and I, we made some mistakes. More than mistakes.
Coming up next, Steve and Ian emerge into a very different time.
That day of the large disco club had come and gone.
It was the dull age.
And Steve's time runs out.
Sounds kind of funny, but you know, I went to the church where they had his funeral, and they had these little ropes out, you know, which was sort of...
When Behind the Music continues. For almost a year in prison, Steve Rubel and Ian Schrager were now just hired hands at their own creation, working for a new boss. It wasn't the same.
You know, after you spend a year in prison, I guess you're scared.
They were shunned by everybody in New York, meaning almost everybody.
And many people actually said disco was dead.
Since the bust, the faltering music that had powered Studio 54's engine had all but died and gone to hell.
You had everybody and their mother doing a disco cover.
I got rhythm, I got music.
It died very fast.
I was happy when it was over.
A significant shift in popular culture had fully materialized. The future was downtown, and it belonged to punk.
You know, why try it again? Do something else. What are you bothering and all that business? 15 months is a long time to have a place closed.
Studio 54's name was far from forgotten, especially by those thousands of people who were never let in. That unrequited hunger was enough to bring the crowds back to the door.
The day it opened, it was jammed.
You know, they have to fill a big room. They need lots of money, so they let in almost anybody, people who are not going to change the scene and make the new underground.
What had been the most fabulous place on earth, a global phenomenon, was now just a profitable, relatively local business. The magic had faded.
Mark never wanted to invest as much as Steve and Ian wanted in productions and things like that. So he wanted to make it more commercial.
And the celebrities stopped going.
And I think that they did not want to go down with it in any respect. And so they probably walked away and have never wanted to really talk about it ever since.
I was not allowed to let any customers in the basement, basically because there were so many wild stories of what went on in the basement. Were the stories true? The stories were true, yes. I just wanted to make the place look straight and wanted to make it look reasonable and not so far out and not so illegal looking.
I think that if the raid had not happened and the studio would have went on and been very strong with Steve and Ian, but eventually it would have changed anyway. I think that what happened just kind of speeded up the change.
That particular time was the amount of time that it should have been. Sort of like a big firework that goes up and explodes across the night sky, and the next thing you know, it's dark.
The not-so-fabulous 80s were now in full swing.
It's the dull age. The 80s are the dull age. I mean, things really got, people completely withdrew. They started staying home a lot. They got totally into money.
Steve and Ian had, in fact, already withdrawn from the front lines of the no longer relevant Studio 54, and it was time to try something new. So they bought a hotel from Mark Fleischman, redesigned it, and named it Morgan's. When they opened in late 1984, Studio was gulping for the thin air of a very different decade.
It takes 3-4 years for certain claims to come to actually go to trial, and all of a sudden, claims were going to trial, and they were awarding everybody. As soon as the jury heard Studio 54, that was it. One incident where somebody was awarded $50,000 because Mark Beneke offended them. The Studio 54 couldn't stay open at that point because it would cost $1 million a year to get insurance. I was looking for a buyer, and I found a buyer. They thought that they were going to do much better than me by making everybody pay. So it lasted like for 3 months. Little by little, it crashed.
Like a monument looking for its lost time, the building at 254 West 54th Street passed obscurely between a few more owners and closed for good as a seedy strip joint. Mark Fleischman went on to open numerous nightclubs in New York and Los Angeles. Meanwhile, Steve and Ian had tried to rekindle their club glory by opening a downtown nightclub called the Palladium in 1985.
I worked with Ian and Steve when they reopened with the Palladium. That never caught the thunder of what Studio had.
It was absolutely beautiful, but that day of the large disco club had come and gone.
It was the end of the disco era. By 85, something else had stolen the headlines, something conclusive to make it frighteningly clear that we could no longer behave the way we used to.
It's sad. Everybody died.
On the night of July 25th, 1989, just 2 months after this interview, Steve Rubell died of AIDS. He was 45 years old.
To live above your potential, that's what we try and do. I mean, we really are just two guys from Brooklyn.
Before Steve's death, he and Ian opened more hotels. In the process, they reinvented the business and became multimillionaires, legally.
You remember, they had lost everything. There were, the people in the nightlife world hated them. They were in jail. And they were able to turn all of that around. Ian Schrager, who is one of the premier developer of hotels, I think, in the country today. I felt very badly that Steve Rubell died so young and died of AIDS.
It was sad. Steve's funeral was sad.
It was strange because you're looking at a bunch of people that only associate themselves with fun.
It sounds kind of funny, but you know, we were at I went to the church where they had his funeral, and they had these little ropes out, you know, which was sort of...
At Steve's grave, it's a little private little grave, and on the grave it says the quintessential New Yorker, and he has a little bench there to sit on by his grave, which is very, very nice.
Just a loving little guy, you know, full of probably as mean and ornery as all of us can be sometimes, but just this really fun, loving guy, and you just sort of felt like, well, that's really and truly the end of something, you know.
All the excesses of the 70s, that high visibility, the whole People magazine thing, that whole life of living your life in public, of doing drugs, of loose sex, everything, all those extremes, people are paying a price for, unfortunately.
He's a good guy. I miss him very much.
Coming up next, looking back.
We've become so politically correct, it's almost looking back at Rome. You know, you can't really do anything today.
Everything we lived turned into a lie. It was like Caligula. All of a sudden, the earth was like opening up and swallowing everyone up.
When Behind the Music continues. Studio 54's glory days ended almost 20 years ago.
Most people agree that 20 years is about the right amount of time for something to become looked back on with love.
It was such a unique phenomenon that it deserves a place in modern-day history.
I believe that that time allowed people to push the envelope in fashion, in art, in life. And I think that that's really, really important.
It takes about 20 years to forget all the bad stuff.
It was a tale of greed and excess and drug invincibility and sexual ignorance and irresponsibility. And it was a lot of fun.
It was the kind of fun that's simply unavailable in these far more conservative times.
We've become politically correct. It's almost looking back at Rome. You know, you can't really do anything today. You're not supposed to drink, you're not supposed to smoke, can't have sex.
All you're left with is a bunch of cigar-smoking, belching Wall Streeters with suspenders left over from the 80s.
Which may explain why the 70s are back. The music, the fashion, new movies about Studio 54. And even a new Studio 54 in America's ultimate recycling bin, Las Vegas.
You got Saddam Hussein, you got AIDS, you got guns, you know. Might be a good time to have a little fun, you know.
One thing about the nostalgia surrounding Studio 54 right now is that this is one of those rare cases where it really was as good as everyone is saying it was.
It was about nothing, and it was just about blowing it out and having fun and not thinking about tomorrow, and especially not thinking about the meaning of all this.
It happened. I don't think we should ponder it. It should just be accepted for what it is. It was a great period.
But Studio 54 was never one simple thing, and looking back at it is no exception.
To think that people are looking back at the 70s like, wow, how free. Though we paid a big price for being free.
There's a dark side to every decade.
Everything we lived turned into a lie. It was like Caligula. All of a sudden, the earth was like opening up and swallowing everyone up.
It's definitely an era that we can't really truly go back to. We can only kind of look back at.
But most of the people that I know really consider that as the greatest time of their life. Whether they're ready for a repeat of that, a rerun, I don't know.
I did it. I don't miss it. I have those memories and that inspiration.
I'm not interested in that nostalgia. You know, I'd rather go out and see something new.
Life goes on.
There's always going to be like another fabulous hotspot. another Studio 54, maybe even better, maybe a legal one.
Studio 54 was a parade of wild contradictions. It was mainstream and underground, liberating and destructive. It was an outrageous experiment that failed. Yet it succeeded in revealing the innocence and ignorance of that lost decade. Studio 54 was a dream we were rudely awakened from. Looking back at it 20 years later poses the challenge to dream an even better dream with our eyes wide open.
I look forward to when they have the next one. Be great.
We were like, wow, because we had never been to studio, so this was going to be our first time. It's like our maiden voyage to the studio, and we were really into it. So we went to the front door. That was a mob scene. That was the first time I laid eyes on Mark Benecking, and we didn't get in. So we said, this must not be the artist entrance. This must not be the stage door. So we went around to the back door, and the guy had a list. And we said, well, we're personal guests of Grace Jones.
And he told me he couldn't get in. He was waiting at the back door.
And he absolutely was not going to budge and let us in. I mean, there was no way. It was just impossible.
And he freaked out.
We walked around the corner to my apartment, which was on 52nd Street. So we started singing an expletive that starts with F and ends with K, and it's a 4-letter word. And we were going, blank off. Do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do, blank off. And my partner Bernard looked at me and says, damn, Niall, that sounds pretty good.